They said it was fair. Not generous, not cruel, just fair. That word sat on the table between us, polished and reasonable, like it was meant to end the conversation. No one raised their voice. No one looked uncomfortable. They smiled the way families do when they believe they've done nothing wrong. I remember nodding, because that's what I'd learned to do over the years. When things didn't feel right, when something inside me quietly folded in on itself, I nodded. It wasn't about the money. At least, that's what they told themselves. It was about what was owed. What had been taken slowly, politely, over decades. And how easily it disappeared once it was written down on paper. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. Because when people believe they're being fair, they tell you exactly who they are. Before we start the story, please tell me about the story in the end, or wherever you left. Just tell me why you are leaving. In this paragraph, what you want me to improve about the stories, even if you don't like the story. Just let me know why you don't like the story. I will be very thankful to you. Now let's move towards the story. I didn't attend the meeting because I expected justice. I attended because families expect attendance. That's how it works when someone dies, especially someone important enough to leave behind assets, opinions, and unfinished authority. My father had always been all three. Even in death, he managed to gather us around a table, like obedient figures in a painting that had faded, but refused to be taken down. In the attorney's office was quieter than I expected. Not solemn, just controlled. Everything in that room felt measured. The spacing of the chairs, the thickness of the carpet, the careful neutrality of the walls. Beige, soft gray, warm wood. Nothing sharp enough to hurt anyone. Nothing emotional enough to remember. My siblings arrived before me. Of course they did. Evan stood by the window, jacket already off, sleeves rolled like he was settling in for something productive. He'd always worn confidence, like a tailored coat, never flashy, never questioned. Margaret sat nearest the table, purse aligned precisely with the edge. Her posture graceful in the way people learn when they've spent their lives being seen. And Thomas leaned back in his chair, hands folded, relaxed in the way only someone certain of their position can be. They all looked comfortable. I hesitated at the doorway, longer than necessary. No one noticed at first. That was familiar too. "Clara," Margaret said eventually, turning with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You made it." I nodded. I always nodded. It saved time. It saved explanations. I chose the chair farthest from the head of the table. That seat had once belonged to my father, and even now, no one dared take it. It sat empty, a quiet reminder of the gravity that had shaped us all. I preferred distance, from him, from them, from expectations. The attorney entered with a folder tucked beneath his arm. He was younger than I'd imagined, early 40s, perhaps, but already practiced in the art of emotional neutrality. He greeted us with professional warmth, offered condolences that sounded rehearsed but sincere enough, and sat down without ceremony. "I understand this is a difficult time," he began, folding his hands atop the folder. "We'll proceed as efficiently and respectfully as possible." Efficient. respectful. Words families like mine relied on when feelings were inconvenient. He explained the process, though Evan interrupted once or twice with questions he already knew the answers to. Margaret listened intently, nodding at the right moments. Thomas glanced at his watch, not impatient, just confident this wouldn't take long. No one looked at me. That was fine. I hadn't come to be seen. When the attorney finally opened the folder, the sound of paper shifting felt louder than it should have. The will was straightforward, he said. No disputes anticipated. Everything had been arranged thoughtfully, with fairness in mind. Fairness. The word landed softly. No one reacted. The house, our childhood home, would be sold. The proceeds divided evenly among Evan, Margaret, and Thomas. The investments, managed jointly by Evan and my father in later years, would transfer to Evan fully, with a note acknowledging his continued stewardship of family assets. Margaret would receive a separate trust, established earlier, designed to ensure long-term stability. Thomas would retain ownership of the lake property. And me, I received a fixed sum, modest, neatly calculated, accompanied by language that described it as a gesture of appreciation. The attorney read it all without inflection, as though listing items on a receipt. When he finished, silence followed. Not stunned silence, not grief-stricken silence, satisfied silence. Evan nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already expected. Margaret exhaled, relieved. Thomas smiled, not broadly, but enough to register quiet approval. It seems fair. Margaret said at last, her voice gentle, diplomatic. Given everything. Everything. That word again. Vague, flexible, convenient. I waited for someone to ask if I had questions, for the attorney to turn toward me, for a pause long enough to suggest my reaction mattered. It didn't come. Instead, Evan leaned forward. Dad wanted things handled cleanly, he said. No confusion, no resentment. Resentment. Another word used to preempt emotions rather than acknowledge them. I think he did the best he could, Thomas added. Considering. Considering what? I wondered. The years I'd moved back home when my mother fell ill. The nights I'd slept on the couch outside her room. The way my career quietly dissolved while I managed medications, appointments, and moods. Or perhaps the years after, when my father needed help himself, when independence became a word he used more out of pride than reality. I'd been there then too, but none of that was written down. The attorney finally looked at me. Miss Caldwell, do you have any questions regarding the distribution? I felt 4 sets of eyes turn my way. Not curious, not concerned, cautious. No, I said. My voice sounded steady. That surprised me. The attorney nodded. Very well. Margaret smiled again, warmer this time. I'm glad this went smoothly. So was I, apparently. We stood, collected coats, exchanged brief condolences for a man we'd all experienced differently. Evan discussed timelines. Thomas mentioned renovations. Margaret suggested dinner sometime soon. Just us. I nodded. Of course. Outside, the afternoon light felt sharper than the muted calm of the office. The city moved on around us, unaware that something permanent had just been quietly decided. I didn't feel angry. That came later. At first, I felt disoriented, like I'd stepped off a familiar path without realizing it. I walked to my car slowly, replaying the language in my mind. Fair, clean, considered. No one had raised their voice. No one had dismissed me outright. No one had been cruel. And yet, something essential had been reduced to a line item. A gesture of appreciation. I sat in the driver's seat, without starting the engine. My hands rested in my lap, still, as if waiting for instruction. I told myself it wasn't about money. That was the first lie. Not because I wanted more, but because money has a way of revealing value when words refuse to. They hadn't stolen from me. They'd simply measured me differently and called it fair. There are things money records very well: transfers, receipts, balances, signatures. And then there are things it never sees. Time spent waiting in hospital corridors, careers paused without ceremony, lives quietly rearranged around other people's needs. Those things never made it into my father's ledger. I drove home that afternoon without turning on the radio. Silence felt appropriate, like a respectful pause after something had ended, though I wasn't sure what exactly. Traffic moved with its usual impatience, everyone heading somewhere important, somewhere chosen. My house waited at the end of a narrow street, modest and familiar. I'd bought it years ago with savings that now felt like they belonged to a younger version of myself. Someone who believed effort always led somewhere visible. Inside, everything was where I'd left it: the armchair by the window, the small bookshelf filled with titles I'd read late at night, when sleep came reluctantly, a framed photo on the mantel, my mother and me, taken before illness softened her features and sharpened her dependence. I removed my coat and set my purse down carefully, as if order itself might offer reassurance. It didn't. I made tea, though I wasn't thirsty. The ritual mattered more than the result. While the kettle heated, my mind drifted backward, not dramatically, not all at once, but in fragments, like scenes resurfacing without invitation. My mother's diagnosis had arrived quietly, a word spoken gently, a prognosis delivered with sympathy and precision. My siblings had reacted the way people often do when crisis collides with busy lives. They'd expressed concern. They'd asked questions. They'd promised to help where they could. But it was understood, without discussion, that I would be the one to stay. I was the flexible one. The unattached one, the one without children, without a title impressive enough to be missed. At first, I told myself it was temporary, a few weeks, maybe months, just until things stabilized. Things never do. My mother needed help bathing, dressing, remembering appointments. Some days, remembering who I was. I learned her medications by color and shape, by the way she winced when swallowing certain pills. I learned how to lift without hurting her, or myself. I learned patience in increments so small they were invisible. I don't remember anyone asking how long I planned to stay. It simply became assumed. Evan visited once a month, sometimes less. He brought groceries, occasionally, and always asked if there was anything we needed. Margaret called weekly, her voice soft, concerned, efficient. Amma sent money, a generous amount at first, which he referred to later as support. They all meant well. That was the phrase they used. When my mother died, I stayed longer. My father didn't ask me to. He didn't need to. He moved through the house like someone who had lost the map to his own life, unsure where to step next. His pride resisted help, but his body betrayed him daily. I filled the spaces he left open. I cooked, cleaned, managed appointments, and eventually, without anyone naming it, I stopped being a daughter and became something closer to infrastructure, reliable, necessary, invisible. The kettle whistled sharply, pulling me back. I poured the water, watched steam rise, and thought about how easily those years had been summarized in a few lines of legal language, a gesture of appreciation. I sat at the table and let the tea cool. That night, sleep came in short intervals. Each time I drifted off, my mind returned to the meeting, not the numbers, but the expressions. The way no one had looked surprised. The way fairness had been agreed upon before I ever entered the room. Morning brought a thin winter light and a sense of dull resolve. I dressed slowly, choosing comfort over intention. There was nowhere I needed to be. That, too, had been shaped by those years. I decided to organize paperwork, not because I needed to, but because order offered the illusion of progress. I pulled old boxes from the closet, documents I'd stored without thought, tax records, medical bills, letters. That was when I found the notebook. It was unremarkable. A spiral-bound pad with a soft blue cover, edges worn. I didn't remember when I'd started using it, only that it had lived in the kitchen drawer for years. Inside were lists, medication schedules, appointment times, notes about reactions, dosages, side effects, pages of handwriting I recognized but barely remembered forming. On the back pages, the lists shifted. Expenses, gas for appointments, medical supplies not covered by insurance, missed workdays, unpaid leave. Not totals, just entries. I hadn't tracked them to keep score. I'd tracked them to survive. I flipped through slowly, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not anger yet, but recognition. This was the ledger no one had asked to see. When Evan called later that afternoon, I almost didn't answer. "Hey," he said, voice casual. "Just checking in. Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. There was a pause. "You sounded quiet earlier." I was listening. Another pause. Subtle, calculated. "I hope you understand," he said carefully. Dad made those decisions years ago. He wanted things to be balanced. Balanced. "I understand," I said. And I did. I understood that balance had been defined by visibility, not weight. After we hung up, I felt the familiar urge to justify, to explain, to remind him of things he already knew. I resisted it. That evening, I walked through the neighborhood. The air was cold but clear. Houses glowed with warm light, windows framing small, contained lives. I wondered how many of them hid quiet sacrifices behind closed doors? How many people were certain their contributions would eventually be recognized? When Margaret invited me to dinner a week later, I accepted. It felt expected. Her house was immaculate, tasteful, every surface intentional. She greeted me warmly, hugged me longer than necessary, as if physical closeness might substitute for conversation. We ate well, drank wine, talked about neutral things. Eventually, inevitably, the inheritance surfaced. "I hope there aren't any hard feelings," she said gently. "Dad trusted Evan with the finances. And you know Thomas, he always loved the lake." "And you," I said. She smiled. "Yes, well, it worked out. Fair." I looked at her then, not with resentment, but curiosity. "Did you ever think about what those years cost?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, just long enough. "You chose to stay," she said. "We all made choices." There it was, the quiet absolution. I nodded. Because arguing would have required them to see something they'd spent decades avoiding. Later, alone again, I returned to the notebook. This time, I didn't close it. I began adding things that had never been written down. Promotions declined. Relationships postponed. Dreams adjusted until they disappeared. Still no totals, just truth. And for the first time since the meeting, I felt something shift. Not anger, clarity. They hadn't forgotten what I'd done. They'd simply never counted it. And now I understood something crucial. Fairness, when defined by those who benefit most, is rarely neutral. There is a moment, sometimes, when understanding arrives without drama. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No sudden revelations delivered like accusations. I was there to deposit the check from my father's estate. The amount was exactly what the attorney had promised. No error, no delay. Clean, efficient, fair. The teller smiled politely, slid the receipt across the counter, and wished me a good day. I stepped outside holding a piece of paper that represented the final valuation of my place in the family. It didn't feel real. Later, at home, I placed the receipt on the table beside the notebook. The contrast struck me immediately. The crispness of the print, the certainty of the number, next to years of uneven handwriting and undocumented effort. I sat down and did something I hadn't allowed myself to do before. I reviewed the will carefully. Not emotionally, not defensively, clinically. The language was precise, crafted, nothing accidental. My father hadn't divided the estate evenly, but he hadn't been careless either. He'd relied on categories: ownership, management, longevity, independence. Each word carried weight. Each definition quietly excluded what couldn't be proven on paper. Caregiving had no category. Sacrifice had no line item. There was, however, one clause that caught my attention. A paragraph referencing prior compensation and support received. It was brief, vague, but deliberate. That clause was the hinge on which everything turned. I called the attorney the next day, not to argue, to ask questions. He listened patiently as I spoke, his tone professional unguarded. Yes, he said when I mentioned the clause. Your father believed prior support had already addressed certain contributions. Support, I repeated. You mean the monthly transfers Thomas sent while my mother was ill? Among other things, he said. And Evan's management of the investments? I asked. Yes. What about the years I lived in the house? I continued. The caregiving? There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just factual. Those were considered personal decisions, he said, not financial contributions. I thanked him and hung up. That was it. The architecture of fairness revealed itself fully. They hadn't taken from me. They'd classified me out of relevance. In the days that followed, I noticed details I'd once ignored. How often Evan referred to what Dad wanted. How Margaret spoke of what made sense. How Thomas joked about how complicated things could have been if emotions had gotten involved. They all believed the same thing, that fairness was achieved when discomfort was minimized for the majority. I attended another family gathering, this time at the lake house. It was Thomas's now, officially, though it had always felt like his. He greeted me warmly, poured wine, gestured expansively at the water, as if generosity could be measured in views. It's good we're still family, he said at one point. Money ruins so many people. I watched the water ripple behind him. It does, I agreed. Later that evening, Evan pulled me aside. I hope you don't feel sidelined, he said. Dad trusted me because I understood the numbers. I know, I replied. You always were more emotional, he added gently, as though offering an explanation rather than a judgment. I smiled. Emotional. That was the word they used when effort couldn't be quantified. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from distress, but from alertness. My mind moved differently now. Sharper. Less forgiving. I returned to the notebook again, but this time I added dates. Cross-referenced bank statements, old emails, medical invoices. I wasn't building a case. I was reconstructing a history. Patterns emerged. The support Thomas sent had stopped quietly when my mother died, despite my father's needs increasing. Evan's management fees had continued regardless of performance. Margaret's trust had been established years earlier, long before any discussion of fairness had occurred. And me? I'd received housing. Yes, food, utilities. But never income, never credit, never acknowledgement. It wasn't oversight. It was design. My father had believed deeply in self-reliance, in visible productivity, in roles that looked respectable from the outside. Caregiving embarrassed him, not because it lacked value, but because it revealed dependence. He'd never said it outright. He didn't have to. The will said it for him. I considered my options. I could contest it. The attorney had mentioned the possibility, almost casually. The evidence I'd assembled could support an argument, if not legally, then morally. It would be exhausting, public, divisive, and it would change nothing essential. Because even if I won, the truth would remain the same. They had never intended to see me as an equal. That realization settled over me like calm. The next time Margaret called, I answered without hesitation. I've been thinking, she said. Maybe we should do something together. Start fresh. Fresh, I echoed. Yes, leave all this behind. I looked at the notebook, at the receipt, at the quiet room around me. I already have, I said. She didn't understand. That was fine. The following week I did something no one expected. I returned the check. Not dramatically, not publicly. I mailed it back to the estate with a short note. I don't need this. Please redistribute it as you see fit. No accusations, no explanations, just a boundary. The response was swift. Calls, messages, confusion disguised as concern. Evan wanted to talk. Thomas wanted to clear things up. Margaret sounded wounded. I declined them all, not out of spite, out of clarity. Because returning the money wasn't a rejection of fairness. It was a refusal to participate in their definition of it. And for the first time, I understood something else as well. They needed me to accept it. My acceptance validated the system. My silence had sustained it for years. But my refusal, quiet, unargued, exposed its fragility. Fairness only works when everyone agrees to the terms, and I no longer did. After I returned the check, something subtle but irreversible shifted. Not in the family, in me. The days that followed were filled with noise I chose not to answer. My phone lit up with missed calls and messages that ranged from confused to wounded to irritated. Evan left 2 voicemails, measured, controlled, increasingly strained. Margaret sent a long text about how unnecessary this was, how it made things harder for everyone. Thomas tried humor, then guilt, then silence. They all assumed I was making a statement to them. They were wrong. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't asking to be understood. I was stepping out of a system that required my quiet participation to function. That realization didn't arrive with relief. It came with unfamiliar emptiness. For years, my identity had been shaped around usefulness, around filling gaps other people didn't want to acknowledge. When I stopped responding, stopped explaining, stopped smoothing things over, there was suddenly time. Too much time. The first week felt disorienting. I woke early out of habit, then lay in bed, unsure what the morning required of me. I made coffee and drank it slowly, noticing how rarely I'd tasted it before. I took walks without destination, sat in rooms without fixing anything. There was grief in that stillness. Not for my father, not for the money, for the version of myself who believed endurance would eventually be recognized. One afternoon, I drove past the old house, the one my siblings planned to sell. The yard was overgrown, the porch light broken. It looked smaller than I remembered, like something that had already begun fading before anyone said goodbye. I parked across the street and watched. I thought about all the things that had happened there without witnesses. The nights my father couldn't sleep. The mornings my mother forgot what day it was. The quiet negotiations I'd made with myself. Just one more year, one more month, one more sacrifice. None of that lived in the walls. Memory doesn't preserve effort. It preserves outcomes. And I had no outcome to show. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the need to. That chapter had already closed. I was just late to notice. The next call I answered was from the attorney. He sounded uncertain, less polished than before. Your siblings are concerned, he said carefully. "They're asking whether there's a legal issue they should be aware of." "There isn't," I replied. "May I ask why you returned the inheritance?" he asked. I considered the question. "Because accepting it would mean agreeing with how it was measured," I said. "And I don't." He was quiet for a moment. "That's unusual." "I know." After we hung up, I felt something close to peace. Not because I'd done something dramatic, but because I'd done something precise. I had removed myself. Weeks passed. The calls slowed. The silence lengthened. Margaret tried once more, inviting me to lunch. Her message was carefully worded, as if she were negotiating rather than reaching out. I declined, not because I was angry, because I finally understood that proximity had always been the currency of my compliance. Distance was my freedom. With that distance came perspective. I began to notice how often women like me existed on the margins of other people's success stories. How frequently care was treated as character rather than labor. How easily families reframed dependency as generosity when it suited them. I wasn't unique. That knowledge didn't diminish my experience. It contextualized it. I started volunteering at a community center, helping others navigate caregiving transitions. Not full-time, not sacrificially, on my terms. The first time someone thanked me without expecting more, it startled me. I also returned to things I'd abandoned quietly years ago. Writing, reading, without purpose. Long afternoons that led nowhere productive. For the first time, my time belonged to me. One evening, months later, a letter arrived from Evan. Not an email, a letter. It was shorter than I expected, less defensive, less certain. He wrote about confusion, about not understanding why my refusal felt like an accusation, about how Dad had trusted him, and how he'd believed that trust meant fairness. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. The letter ended with a question. "What do you want now?" I folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond, because the answer had nothing to do with him. I wanted a life that didn't require justification. I wanted decisions that weren't framed as sacrifices. I wanted to exist without being tallied. That winter, I sold my house. It wasn't impulsive. I'd thought about it for years, though I'd never allowed myself to consider it seriously. The sale gave me enough to move somewhere smaller, quieter, a place where no one knew my history. On the day I left, I stood in the empty living room and felt no nostalgia. Just gratitude for shelter that had served its purpose. At my new place, mornings were different. The light fell differently. The air felt unclaimed. No one expected anything from me. That was the gift. Occasionally, I heard updates through distant channels. The lake house renovation stalled. The family home sold for less than anticipated. Tensions rose, not dramatic, just persistent. Fairness, it turned out, was harder to maintain without someone quietly absorbing its flaws. I was not invited to those conversations. And, for the first time, exclusion felt like relief. On my birthday, a card arrived from Margaret. It was kind, generic, careful. I read it, then placed it in a box with others, artifacts of a life that no longer required maintenance. That night, I sat on my porch and listened to the quiet. Not the kind filled with absence, but the kind that makes room for thought. I realized then that walking away hadn't cost me anything essential. What it had cost them, however, was something they couldn't name. A witness. Someone who remembered what fairness had required. And without that memory, they were left only with numbers. Numbers that would never quite add up. I didn't win anything. I didn't reclaim my place. I didn't correct the past. But I chose something else. I chose not to be measured by systems that benefited from my silence. I chose not to negotiate my worth. I chose a life that didn't need to be called fair. And that choice, quiet, uncelebrated, final, was the only inheritance I ever truly claimed. In the end, there was no courtroom victory, no apology that changed the past, no moment where everyone finally understood. There was only a quiet decision to stop explaining what should have been obvious, to stop hoping fairness would come from people who benefited from its absence. Some losses are loud, others happen politely, in rooms filled with reasonable words and careful smiles. But what I learned is this: you don't have to reclaim your place in a family that never truly made space for you. You can step away, carry what matters, leave behind what never counted you in the first place. I wasn't written into the ledger the way they were, but I no longer measure my life by columns meant to erase me. Do you believe walking away can be more powerful than fighting for what was taken? Why or why not? And so, another story finds its place by the fireside. I hope it kept you company, whether on a long road, during a quiet evening, or in the moments you needed a story to step into. This has been a Heartlight Saga, and there are always more secrets to uncover. If this journey stayed with you, if you felt the chill or the mystery settle in, I would be so grateful if you'd let me know. Leave a comment below and tell me, what part of the story lingered with you the longest? Your thoughts not only mean the world to me, but they help shape the tales I tell next. Like the video, share with someone who might like the story, and subscribe the channel Heartlight Saga. And if you're yearning for another story right now, the story doesn't have to end. I have another tale waiting for you. From my hearth to yours, thank you for listening. Until the next story begins.